This is another wonderful young voice in this space. And I turn up to the University of Wollongong to give a talk to early career researchers. I was invited back, Jackie. And I just chose to sit at a table. It was physical, but we had to have social distancing. And I just decided to sit on a table. And Erin walks in, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes later. And we have one of those conversations where I say to Erin, "What do you do, Erin?" "Hi, my name's Katina." You know, she thought I was one of the early career researchers. And I said, "Oh, I do this." And, you know, and she said, "This is what I do." And I said, "Wow, you do that?" And it was like, yeah, like, why are you so interested in it? Because I love your research. Your research has to be prominently out there. And then she says, "You know Professor Wernemont?" I said, "Yes." And that's her book. I'm buying her book. She bought her book the same day. But these are when voices come together, and we are not alone in this quest. I think the more we are authentic, the more we open our mouths and talk about things, the more we're going to find each other and actually find with the majority. We want change. And so with that introduction, I introduce to you ErinTwyford from the University of Wollongong, and say thank you, Professor Wernemont, and thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Professor Wernemont. That was absolutely incredible, and I have so much to think about, and it's actually really reinvigorated. I've had a bit of a tough week in academia this week, so I'm very excited to have something to go on with. So thank you so much to Katina for inviting me here today. I feel so honoured and privileged to be speaking with you all about my research. The title of my presentation is "The Thanatic Political State, Accounting and the Citizenry." But the sort of research that I do, I would say that I'm very interested in the way in which a state or states control and discipline the lives of their citizens through various apparatuses, including the practice of accounting, throughout their lives and into their death. And my research looks at this using the Holocaust as an extreme example of a thanatic political state. So I thought I would just start by looking at, well, what do you think accounting is? And for me, most people, when I talk, I say, you know, I do accounting, I'm an accountant, and instantly their eyes glaze over and they're not so interested anymore. And they'll say, "Oh, okay, what did you do your thesis on?" And when I start talking about the Holocaust and state control of citizen bodies, they start to get a little bit more interested. So I think that the dominant view out there of accounting is that it is this neutral, objective, disinterested, factual, reflective, in that it reflects through the numbers what is happening in reality. It's passive, it's just representing things numerically, and it's based on economic rationalism. When in fact, I believe anyway, it is the total opposite of that. I believe that accounting and the way that it counts things is biased, it's subjective, it is deeply involved in the meaning-making process. It's implicated in power relations. It's not reflective, it's constructive. It's not reflecting reality, it is actually constructing a reality. It is active. It doesn't represent reality. It will either conceal or at best partially represent reality, and it is ideologically driven. So there is a very pervasive and concealed role of accounting in facilitating state and citizen relations. So as a process of attributing financial values and rationales to a wide range of social practices, what accounting does, it can confer specific visibilities, calculability, operational utility, and for me, most importantly, and Professor Wernemont touched on this, silences. So the overall effect of silences hides the human element present in transactions, which serves to dehumanize, de-individualize, and degrade humans. Silences in accounting obscure the social, moral, ethical, and ultimately human elements that are so important. And the perpetration of such silences, I believe, requires exposure, which I attempt to do in my research by giving notion to the idea of a financial life. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But the idea is to give extra dimension to numbers through the integration of context and participants. So what is the hidden power of this outwardly passive, disinterested technology? So by making certain aspects of reality visible accounting creates the possibility of controlling these elements. And it is this partiality in representation and its control potential which constitutes its real social influence, and in that, its social danger. So it's really important that we pay attention to the mutually constitutive nature of accounting, which means viewing it as much more than an instrumental or purely technical activity. In particular, as I've mentioned, accounting does not reproduce the visible, it renders visible. And this rendering has the impact of modifying human features that are not amenable to measurement and reporting in a numerical format. So in the Holocaust, this extended to making people invisible by ascribing them numbers and stripping them of their identity. So in looking past the numbers, I read a lot of survivor testimony, and one survivor stated, "We had no name, we were only a number. We were a labor unit, not people." And what this enabled was it meant the Nazis could avoid divulging the human correspondence of their accounts. The Jewish people were recognized no longer as a social being. They became invisible and ceased to exist as people. So in periods of human suffering, human accounting can be used as a tool, or what I would actually call a weapon, by the state to render the human side of reality invisible. So when we deny the intrinsic value of people through this dehumanized rhetoric of quantification, we maintain the dominant discourse that society or the people in power want to maintain. So accounting has its own inherent and silent power, which is produced and promoted by mainstream theorists and researchers, by practitioners, by users and standard setters, who are maintaining that it's merely reflecting a factual reality. So this myth continues to legitimize the practice and use of accounting information at a political and economic level, while totally obscuring the social, moral, ethical, and ultimately human element, which shrouds the numbers in just this one-dimensional meaning. So conversely, where numbers are not provided, this indicates that that which is not captured by accounting must be without value. So accounting is, I believe, a social practice which is intimately linked to how humans structure and enact relations with each other within social and political communities. To the extent that these relations can always be structured differently, they're political choices, and accounting is political in precisely this sense. That which accounting counts and values is deemed worthwhile, while what accounting does not count is deemed to be of no value. So the consequence of this is that accounting is contributing to wrong ways of thinking by reducing all problems to economics, which masks the intrinsic worth of what is being measured, namely people's lives that are destroyed or being destroyed, which allows the perpetrators of death and destruction to rationalize their inhumanity in the name of economic growth, or, as I found in my research with the Holocaust, in the name of a political ideology. So policy can have life or death consequences for individuals, and this was particularly evident during the Holocaust, where human beings lost their distinctiveness as they were presented as this value-free measurement. And that non-value that was ascribed to that human experience, to their individuality and to possibilities of emancipation, excludes these elements from political and economic considerations. And where humanity then conflicts with the overarching goals of those in power, it can be devalued or removed from the gamut of information that is supplied by accounting. So I'm going to start then with the premise that accounting is not an instrument of mere calculation, description, and reflection, but it has consequences, most of which should be intended, otherwise it has no value as a practice or as a technology. So therefore, the use of accounting cannot be neutral or disinterested if it is to fulfill its mission. And this hidden power requires exposure. So by translating the values of the political and economic hegemony into the respected objectivity of an accounting representation, the invisibilities remain hidden and that which is not valued remains unimportant. So in conducting my research, I found I needed new theoretical tools in my toolkit to reconstruct how the use of accounting was used to mystify and mask the true nature of economic events, what was happening in corporations, what was happening in governmental transactions, where we see really complex issues just reduced to numbers. So to do this, I actually started with Michel Foucault and his idea of sovereign power, which is the idea that a state will try to make die certain members of the citizenry and allow or let the others live. And Foucault actually changed his thesis, and Professor Wernemont did touch on this when she mentioned biopolitics. So Foucault actually changed his views and said the inverse was actually what was happening, where a state was actively trying to make live certain members of the society while letting die others. And Foucault's work on biopolitics is a little bit unfinished because of his untimely death. So I went to the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who kind of took up this mantle, and he said, well, actually, what's happening is a bit of both. The state is actively trying to make live desirable members of the citizenry, while at the same time actively trying to make die or to kill undesirable members of the citizenry. And Agamben says that this can actually be achieved in a democratic state, which was what happened when the Nazis came to power. They were elected democratically, and their executive power was constitutionally enshrined. And he says that that is enabled through the opening of a space called the state of exception. So over 147 constitutions around the world have this provision where if a state is facing a real crisis, state of emergency, whether that's internally or externally, they are allowed to call that state of emergency, which basically suspends the constitution and gives executive power to whoever is in charge. So the Nazis did this. Their parliament was burnt down. They claimed it was a communist act. They called it for a state of emergency, and so opened this peripheral space called the state of exception. And that state of exception is a place where you can put people, and they did. They started with communists, and whatever you do with people in that space is legal. If whatever violence you enact upon them is done so with impunity. And I just found that really interesting, that this was a space of legalized lawlessness, if you like, where human rights, where constitutional rights, everything was gone, and the state could deal with you how they liked. Now, Agamben also spoke about, well, how do we determine who goes in the state of exception and who gets to remain in the civil sphere? And he brought it back to some Aristotelian origins and the idea of Zoe and Vio. And apologies if I'm not saying that correctly. So Zoe is the life form that is common to all living organisms. So we are born, we reproduce, we survive, some of us, and we die. It's really base primal elements of living. And Aristotle and Agamben both say that the thing that differentiates humans from other microorganisms and other things that may possess Zoe is this idea of Vio, which is the ability to live a political life, the ability to be present in the polis. So when I came to do my research, I actually thought, you know what, there's another Vio. So now we have to call Aristotle and Agamben's Vio political Vio, or political life. And there's now a financial Vio, because humans have financial lives. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So then what I devised was the idea of a theoretical triptych based on these ideas of Foucault and Agamben. So in the first panel, so a triptych is a story told in 3 panels. So the first panel there is the loss within a thanatopolitical state of financial Vio, where the state is actively trying to make die your financial life. The second panel is your political Vio, so the state actively trying to kill your political life. And the final panel is the loss of Zoe, or the loss of existential life. So in demonstrating the utility of this triptych, I use the actions of the corporations Deutsche Bank, Ford Werk Motor Company, and Degussa as illustrative examples of how businesses deployed thanatopolitical state imperatives as concealed by silences in accounting and represented through counter accounts. So this was a question that was posed, how do we bring back the human element? And the way in which I've tried to do it is through the notion of a counter account, or an account that goes against what was accounted for. It kind of fills the gaps in the accounting reports to bring back the lived human experience as it fell outside the rhetoric of accounting, allowing the people who were placed in that state of exception, who were not deemed of value, to reinstate themselves as these major characters in the story of the Holocaust. So I believe that we needed to add this financial VO because it is quite different to a political VO. So citizen identity is often couched in terms of your labour or possession of capital and property. When we situate our place in the world or give an account of ourselves, we do not refer to our intrinsic values of political action often, because this is essentially beyond societal expectations. So when you meet someone for the first time, what do most people ask you? And they say, what do you do? So they are asking for an answer for you to account for yourself in an economic term. So for example, what job, what labour do you perform? Or they might ask, where do you live? Where are you from? And again, that has socio-economic connotations. So what happens is our sense of self becomes shaped by a series of transactions that cheapen our identity to what Hannah Arendt would call economic men or economic people. So to bring the notion of political VO back to what I believe is its Aristotelian origins, I situated financial life as a means to a political life. So in modernity, we've seen a reversal of this process where a political life is a means to a financial life. But I just don't see that happening. And I think that the abject poor would agree that their life is politicized and they are not members of the polis because they don't possess that financial VO. So to achieve this, I posit that the notion of political VO actually is excluding the idea of financial or economic identity. And if we don't highlight the financial, we risk its disappearance into the political and its subsequent abandonment. If we can draw attention to financial VO, the often neglected financial persecution of citizens can be re-emphasised, which gives space for the role of accounting in such persecution to be further examined. So now we've established citizens have financial lives, the dominant mode of understanding these lives is accounting. And the often mundane expression of people's lives can be rendered unimportant among other social, political, and legal theorizations. So I was not surprised by the fact that Foucault and Agamben did not address accounting or the veiled power of it. So accounting operates surreptitiously, but nonetheless imparts human representation in accounting forms, which then can be used as a tool or a weapon, apt for use by a state in implementing its policies. So accounting is intimately linked to the exercise of state power in that it is used by the state to operationalize abstract political objectives. Thus, we see accounting actually intervening into the private sphere and the private lives of citizens to deliver and enforce state directives, which can make live if you're desirable or make die if you are not desirable, your financial VO. So I primarily looked at how businesses did this during the Holocaust. So Deutsche Bank was one such business that became an instrument for facilitating the loss of financial VO. What they deemed their administration of bank accounts was major business for them, where most of the true owners of the property were the murdered victims of the National Socialist genocide. So to give a brief contextual information, there were mass boycotts happening at this time for Jewish-owned businesses. There was a policy called Aryanization, which was basically the German state trying to exclude any sort of Jewish influence from the economic sphere. And this extended to laws that meant they couldn't work, which meant they couldn't earn money, which means that they were vulnerable, to not being allowed to have Jewish-owned businesses. So the Aryan businesses would come in and take over. So once they were depleted of the economic resources and the social privileges that these resources once provided, most Jewish people who had not escaped Nazi Germany were subjected to further exploitation and degradation. So this first panel of the triptych really emphasizes the notion that confiscation of wealth and seizure of property acts as an important catalyst in accelerating the downward spiral across the threshold to genocide and to further exercises of vanity power. So I've got just a little excerpt from the Deutsche Bank annual report, and you can see down the bottom there that it bears the Nazi insignia. So in their annual reports, they made use of several techniques, including euphemism, or what was termed Nazi Deutsch rhetoric, and also just outright silences in their annual reports to conceal the nature of the transactions aimed at Jewish economic extermination. So they even altered the accounting to a form of Nazi Deutsch to obscure the true nature of events and transactions, which enabled both the state and Deutsche Bank to conceal their involvement in this eradication of financial VO. When I undertook a close reading of their annual reports, it revealed that Aryanizations were being disguised by being placed into an account which they called special items or one-off transactions, which was basically Nazi Deutsch for Aryanization related activities, including the sale of securities, real estate, and brokerage fees. In the absence of Nazi Deutsch, Deutsche Bank simply remained silent on their role within the Aryanizations. So in examining their annual reports from the Nazi period of 1933 to 1944, only one report specifically mentioned details surrounding an Aryanization, where they stated, in Berlin, we've taken over the customers of the Bank Mendelssohn & Co. for our newly acquired business associates. The silence on any further details obscures several important things. First, that this takeover was in fact a forced Aryanization of a Jewish-owned banking firm. Second, that the Deutsche Bank had an active role in this Aryanization and was therefore complicit in denuding the Jewish owners of their financial VO. And third, that if the accounting had been made visible, it would have shown an acquisition far below its market value, which would have indicated political pressure. The Aryanization of other German banks was simply subsumed under that special items or one-off transactions account without any explanation, which concealed those exploitative acts of Deutsche Bank and thanatos political imperatives of the Nazi state. The account of those who were impacted by the Aryanizations was silenced because it fell outside of that sterile discourse of accounting. When I undertook further investigations into these Aryanizations, it revealed that while some of the non-Aryans who had been stripped of their financial VO had managed to immigrate, albeit in quite a destitute state, others were placed into concentration camps where very few survived. So this was all undertaken in a very democratic way. These were all laws that passed through German parliament, albeit under that state of exception. But many of the distinctive legislative instruments that were designed to rid the Jewish people of their financial VO later facilitated the removal of their political VO through denationalisation and restrictions on liberty. The revocation of political VO was primarily facilitated by the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which ensured that life and death were not properly scientific concepts, but rather political concepts. So without financial means and civil rights, Jews and other undesirables were forcibly placed into a range of camps, which were the state of exception, that space that exists within the state but outside of the state, and used as slave or forced labour. So Jewish slave labourers during the Holocaust were not treated even as productive assets. Rather, in most cases, these humans were treated as commodities to be used up in the production process. And this really differs from a lot of the literature that's done on accounting for slavery, where while abhorrent, they were treated as assets to be maintained. They wanted these people to live so they could continue to work. Whereas the slave labour produced during the Holocaust, they were never intended to live. It was a very quick turnover process. So many businesses actively embraced the use of slave labour because such labour was perceived as cheap and good for the bottom line. And these companies exhibited ambivalence towards the violence, degradation and starvation that was imposed on workers. So the loss of financial VO enabled through legislation established the conditions for complete exploitation by profit-driven companies such as Ford, which led to the loss of political VO. So Ford made use of foreign forced labourers, POW labour and slave labour from Buchenwald concentration camp, which was practicing what they termed an extermination through labour program. So I have there an income statement which comes from Buchenwald. And for those who maybe are not familiar with accounting, our income statement tells us the revenue, how much money we've received, our expenses, how much we have paid to give us a net profit. Now, this outwardly appears like a normal income statement. However, it pertains to prisoners that were used as slave labourers. So we can see there the revenue. So that wasn't the money that the slave labourers received. That was the money the state received from these businesses for leasing out the slave labour. You can see there we have expenses such as clothing, food, a pittance. And then at the end, we see that net profit per prisoner. So the state was making the money from leasing out the slave labourers. We look a little bit deeper, we can see there the times are put on there too. Expected lifespan in months, 9 months was the expected lifespan for the slave labourers. So they were literally worked to death. We see there too, revenue at death. So that pertains to the fact that when these slave labourers were eventually killed through work, they sold their hair to fill mattresses and their body fat to make soap. So even upon death, the state was controlling the lives of these citizens and monetizing them. Workers were differentiated into racial categories as mandated by the state, and these categories determined wages, conditions, food supplies, and the work to be performed. Inhumane treatment of labourers was encouraged by the Nazis as long as it was in accordance with those state-derived racial hierarchies in order to separate the racial pedigree between the different workers. The foreign workers were exposed to varying levels of starvation depending on racial categorisation, as Ford was able to account for a large leeway to deduct for food and lodging, which of course never made it to the mouths of these prisoners. The payroll accountant at Ford testified soon after the war that after withdrawals for taxes, insurance, lodging and food, some workers received less than half the wages due to them under the regulations. And I'm talking here about forced labourers, not slave labourers, who of course never saw any money. So clearly the profit motive of Ford prevailed over the care of its workers, while concurrently supporting political imperatives towards the death of the Jewish people and other prisoners. So the dehumanisation of the workers was revealed primarily to me through testimony, as many survivors recall they were treated like animals or livestock. When not viewed as humans, they were not treated as such, which led to these acts of violence and exposure to death. Of all the degrading and horrific experiences of the forced labourers at Ford, the most common survivor testimony related to that de-individualisation and dehumanisation accorded through identification by number. Stripping people of their individuality and sense of self through legal instruments and Nazi actions designed to make invisible, brutalised the human experience. As one forced labourer recalls, we got numbers. We had a sign with a card. They hung that around our necks where we were all naked. And that was your entry number as a prisoner in Buchenwald. I had number 481756. You had to be able to read that in German and remember it, because constantly when you were in the camp later, you might be called for any reason. They called us by number, never by name. So from this illustration, an appreciation of the precarious nature of personal freedom and political life in instances where states implement a state of exception can be formed. Lost political VO as well as financial VO facilitated dehumanisation, which enabled inhumane treatment. Once the liberty, freedom and rights of these humans were stripped away, either by law or by the threat of violence, the next goal of the political state was extermination of Jewish and non-Aryan Zoe. So the final panel in the triptych relates to the loss of life experienced by over 6 million people during the Holocaust. And I wish there was a more visceral way that I could present that number. The loss was affected in a number of ways: poisoning in the gas chambers, execution through firing squads, starvation, death as a result of harsh conditions in the camp, death through labour, and even violence that was meted out as punishment or even amusement by guards, possible due to the prior removal of financial and political VO, which basically was a way of offering these financially and politically dead people to the state of exception and the unfettered violence within. So, as was the case with Aryanisation and slave and forced labour practices, business decisions became life and death decisions. Mass gassings were devised as a way for the Nazis to deal with the genocide in a manner similar to production in a factory, that is, killing based on the detailed organisation and principle of the assembly line. Accountants were intimately part of this process, where they used a cost-benefit analysis to compare the cost of killing children with gas and then burning their bodies to the alternative of burning the children to death. 10 cents per child could be saved by the state in not gassing the children first. German pharmaceutical companies such as Degussa, through its subsidiary Degesch, produced that gas Zyklon B that was used directly in this assembly line of death, amounting to over 1 million dead in Auschwitz. Despite this fact, corporate officials denied knowledge of the use of the gas, noting that their job was to supply the Nazis as far as output and the allocations of the working committees allowed, and what they did with the substance was none of their business. So the state vanity political imperative was facilitated by a very complex matrix of interrelated actors and practices that had horrific consequences for people. The defining condition that allowed for the operation of Thanatos power and the pursuit of death in various forms was that suspension of civil rights in conjunction with supreme executive power, all constitutionally valid through the enactment of the state of exception. So within the broader socio-political legal context, accounting has largely escaped implication for its peripheral yet integral role in the death of citizens and the accounting for the death of citizens. So using this theoretical triptych has helped provide for me new understandings and render visible that which was previously concealed by accounting practices by examining those silences in the accounts and utilising subject testimony as a counter account. So accounting as a social practice primes organisational systems, human behaviour and political action, all of which directly impact the lives of people. And the mobilisation of accounting during totalitarian, thanatopolitical, or even democratic governments in this pursuit of thanatopolitics can disguise the reality behind transactions and death in its financial, political, and actual forms by using these one-dimensional integers, which totally masks the amorality of such action. The numbers remain silent on so many things. Other states of exception, including war, political turmoil, natural disasters, and even pandemics, are of increasing concern. And I believe they require something like this new set of theoretical tools with which to recognise the implications of accounting. Because as long as accounting continues to operate clandestinely and insidiously, it can continue to reify power, state discipline of citizen bodies, and control over debt. So that's been my brief sort of introduction to my research. Thank you so much. I'm so privileged to be here. And if you would like to contact me further, I would be very happy to hear from you. My email is there, or you can follow my Twitter handle as well.
Let's go to questions. I know that was a heavy presentation, Erin. We thank you.
I can go, Katina.
Go ahead, Eusebio. Thank you.
Erin, it's a very interesting day today because I mentioned that I am professor of information systems, but I am in a business school. And the meeting I had before you guys was actually with accountants talking about auditing in AI. And I was talking about ethical algorithms too. So one of the questions that actually comes to my mind is this kind of discourse. It's almost impossible to see in a business school many times. And where are you able to share those, like to publish, for example, something like that? I would love to see that in accounting. We just published at the military the analysis of technology through accounting over the last 30 years. And guess what? On the 256 papers we analyzed, I would say tending to zero was the amount of work that was looking at accounting as with the other than an instrumental, technical, but actually a social created subject that actually has a social function. So what are your perceptions about that, and where can you have these discussions other than in this forum? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Look, there's not a huge amount. If you're comparing to traditional accounting research, we do have, and I say we, so there is a group of critical accounting scholars. There is space for us, but it is certainly not as, there aren't as many options as mainstream. So there are ways for us to get our research out, but I think our next challenge will actually be ways of getting our research beyond the critical accounting community, because we tend to just read those journals. So then, like, most people aren't going to go read a journal called Critical Perspectives on Accounting and be able to find this sort of information. So that's really our next step. I'm trying to think about, well, how can we have a bit more visibility in the social and public spaces? Because for me anyway, I believe the work we do is so important, and it needs to be there to sort of counter that mainstream view. Yeah.
No, and I believe you have a humongous opportunity here, especially as accounting is being transformed and a lot of the decision making is being delegated to machines. So having that critical view and saying, hold on a second, look at the past, how this numbers were used, and even though the decision making becomes dehumanized by saying, well, we have this algorithm that improves 0.65% of performance, and off we go. So I think you have an amazing opportunity here. And to a certain extent, what I'm seeing in different communities of different areas of business, I think this pandemic has brought some level of consciousness that this focus on our research only on performance hasn't been very good. And we need to think further, what outcomes are coming from that, from the practices and that we do and so forth. So I'm looking forward to see what you're coming up with, because I think you have a wonderful pathway, especially looking into that, and especially when you look at the future of accounting. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think similar to what Professor Wernemont was saying too, we need these diverse disciplines to talk to each other, because otherwise we're missing parts of the picture and ways in which we can sort of move towards that better, more just society.
Erin, thank you so much. It's Katina. I am conscious of time, but I'm also conscious that there were a couple of questions. You're going to find as you're going through comments in response, I think a lot of us were really pinged by that 10 cents saving statement you made on one of the political losses and existential life losses. Toby, you had a question. I don't know if you want to ask it now quickly.
Yes, thank you. The question is really considering the origins of these technologies, whether it's the machines that are used to do these tabulations, whether it's the technology of accounting itself, the ledgers, the mortality bills that Jacqueline was talking about earlier. Can we redeem these things? Is there some redemption for the quantifying of humans that that leads us in a different place, or is it just that so I'm Jewish, and in my tradition, like, we're told not to count people, right? We can count something as a substitute of people, but we can't count people. And with examples like you've shared, it really brings up the most negative end of the spectrum of what can happen when we count people. So to your understanding, is there a positive use of this kind of technology and approach?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. Look, I want to remain optimistic. I want to believe that there is a better path forward. I think that absolutely we can do it. Whether or not that gets co-opted by corporations in the way that environmental accounting has, I don't hold a lot of hope on that respect. But it would just be so great if we could get some sort of social accountants, right? So people that don't just do financial accounting, management accounting, but actually look at the social lives of people, and they don't quantify that, but they add to the other accounting information to make sure that we're getting more of a holistic view of what's happening in a transaction or an event, looking at the actual human elements, because at the end of the day, that's what we should be concerned about, not the monetary values, not the commoditization. We should be concerned about, well, what does this mean for people, and what can we do better for people? I would really hope that at some point we could move away from this idea that information that's useful for decision making, which is the whole premise of accounting, those decision makers are not just shareholders. If we could provide information and not based on the idea that the only people who care are the people who are either going to make money off it or not.
Thank you.
I hope so. I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Erin.